The autumn of 1874 painted Kansas Territory's whispering valley in hues of gold and amber, but the dark stains seeping into Samuel Turner's weathered porch steps told a different story. 3 men, their counterfeit badges catching the late afternoon sun, cornered the elderly farmer against his own front door. Their leader, a man whose smile held all the warmth of a winter grave, pressed his Colt revolver against Turner's temple. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, friend, the man drawled, his voice dripping with false courtesy. I'm going to ask you one more time. Where's the old farmer who owns Shadow Creek Farm? Turner's rheumy eyes darted toward his fields, probably wishing he'd never mentioned the peculiar homesteader who'd been buying extra supplies in town lately. I don't know much about him, Marshal Reeves. Just that he keeps to himself, tends his wheat. Nothing special about him. Nothing special. Reeves's laugh could have withered crops. That nothing special farmer somehow managed to take down 3 of my best men last week. Didn't even leave tracks. Now, what kind of simple wheat farmer you know can do that? Before Turner could answer, the crunch of autumn leaves announced a new arrival. A figure shuffled up the dirt path, shoulders bent against the October wind. Daniel Hawthorne, the man they'd been discussing, gripped a gnarled walking stick as he squinted at the scene before him. At 65, he looked every bit the frail farmer they described, from his patched wool coat to his mud-caked boots and the threadbare scarf wrapped around his neck. Reeves's men tensed, hands hovering over their holsters, but their leader waved them down with a smirk. What threat could this old man pose? The younger of his 2 companions, a wiry fellow with a face like spoiled meat, actually chuckled at the sight of Daniel's apparent frailty. Shadow Creek Farm sat like a forgotten promise in the valley's embrace, nestled between ancient oaks and the winding creek that gave it its name. Daniel Hawthorne had chosen this spot 3 years ago for its isolation, though he told folks it was for the rich soil. The main house, built solid from local oak, watched over a collection of well-maintained barns and corrals. Everything about it spoke of careful planning, right down to the clear sight lines in every direction and the subtle ways the outbuildings provided cover for anyone moving between them. Inside, Daniel moved with the deliberate slowness of age, setting his morning coffee to boil while his granddaughter Mary kneaded bread dough at the kitchen table. At 16, she had her mother's copper hair and a spirit as untamed as the wild horses that sometimes roamed their valley. They'd found each other 2 years ago when Daniel discovered her hiding in his barn, half-starved and running from shadows neither of them spoke about. Her thin fingers still bore the calluses of someone who'd learned to survive by any means necessary. You're thinking awful hard for someone just making coffee, Mary observed, flour dusting her forearms. Her keen eyes, sharp as any hunter's, missed little about the man who'd given her a home. She'd learned early that survival often depended on reading people's unspoken thoughts. Daniel allowed himself a small smile, one that barely touched the corners of his mouth. Just wondering if Thompson's stallion is worth the asking price. Heard could use some new blood. He didn't mention the men he'd spotted watching his property last week, or the way they'd tracked his movements with professional precision. No, need to worry her with such things. Mary wiped her hands on her apron, leaving white handprints that matched the ones on her cheeks. Speaking of horses, Michael Bennett rode by yesterday while you were checking the south field. Says his father's willing to pay top dollar for some of our yearlings. Her voice carried a hint of something more than casual interest when she mentioned the young man's name. Daniel's hands stilled momentarily on the coffee pot, his weathered fingers tightening imperceptibly on the handle. Michael Bennett, eh? Been seeing a lot of that boy lately. His voice carried a weight Mary couldn't quite understand, heavy with memories of other young men whose charm had hidden darker purposes. He's nice. Mary's defense came quickly, but her eyes dropped to the dough, her fingers working the bread with suddenly nervous energy. Besides, he's teaching me to shoot better. The coffee pot clattered against the stove harder than necessary, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the quiet kitchen. Shooting? Since when do you need shooting lessons? Since always. You won't teach me proper, just basic safety rules. Michael says a girl ought to know how to defend herself out here. Mary's chin lifted in that stubborn way that reminded Daniel so much of another young woman long ago, one whose fate had set him on the path that led to this quiet valley. Daniel felt the familiar ache in his right shoulder, where an old bullet still nestled close to bone. A souvenir from a life he'd tried to leave behind. Basic rules keep people alive, Mary. Anything more than that tends to invite trouble. The words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom, each syllable paid for in blood. He'd spent years cultivating this image of a simple farmer, someone whose hands shook too much to shoot straight, the kind of man who'd need help from young Michael Bennett to defend his property. Their morning routine continued, each movement a carefully choreographed dance around the truth, a performance they'd perfected. Over their years together, Daniel fed the chickens, his limp more pronounced when Mary watched from the kitchen window. He checked the fence lines with exaggerated slowness, making sure the farmhands they'd hired saw nothing but an aging farmer fighting time's cruel march. But in the barn, alone with the horses, Daniel's movements shifted, his hands steady as mountain stone as he cleaned and oiled a hidden Henry rifle with practiced precision. The weapon's stock bore no initials, but the notches along its barrel told stories he'd spent years trying to forget, each mark a memory of a time when his aim had been as famous as his name. The farmhands whispered sometimes about the strange precision of Shadow Creek's operations, how the livestock never seemed to get rustled despite the troubles other farms faced, how predators mysteriously avoided their herds, how their boss, old Daniel Hawthorne, seemed to know about trouble coming before it arrived. Must be luck, Daniel would say, his voice trembling just enough. The Lord watches over fools and old men. But the Lord had nothing to do with the carefully placed mirrors in the barn cupola that allowed him to watch the valley approaches, or the cached weapons hidden throughout the property, each cleaned weekly when the hands were away, or the fact that Daniel knew every ridge, cave, and hollow within 10 miles of his land. When Mary asked why he'd chosen this particular valley, he'd spin tales about good water rights and fertile soil. He never mentioned how the terrain offered perfect ambush points, or how the creek's bend created a natural barrier against surprise attacks. Some knowledge was better left unshared, some skills better left forgotten. That morning, as Daniel watched Mary practice her roping in the corral, Michael Bennett rode up on his chestnut gelding. The boy's smile carried no obvious threat, his wave friendly as summer sunshine, but Daniel noticed how his gun belt rode low, how his right hand never strayed far from its grip. Little tells that spoke volumes to those who knew how to read them. "Morning, Mr. Hawthorne," Michael called out, all politeness and charm. "Think we might discuss them, yearlings?" Daniel nodded, maintaining his careful shuffle as he moved toward the corral fence. "Sure, boy. Mary, why don't you fetch our guest some coffee?" As his granddaughter hurried inside, Daniel studied Michael Bennett with eyes that had once tracked men across 3 territories. The boy's father, James Bennett, had been asking a lot of questions lately, about water rights, about cattle trails, about the strange sounds some claimed to hear from Shadow Creek at night, questions that reminded Daniel too much of another time, another life. "Your pa still planning that big drive come spring?" Daniel asked, his voice quavering just enough. Michael leaned against the fence, trying to look casual, but betraying his tension in a dozen tiny ways. "Yes, sir. Hoping to take the herd clear to Missouri this year." Daniel nodded, calculating distances and timing in his head. Missouri meant the river trail, meant narrow passes and blind corners, meant perfect places for an ambush if someone was of such a mind. The coffee would give them time to talk, time for Daniel to assess whether Michael Bennett was truly sweet on his granddaughter or playing a deeper game. Time to decide if the boy's questions were innocent or if, like so many others before him, He'd somehow caught the scent of a past that refused to stay buried. In the distance, storm clouds gathered. Over the prairie, Daniel's shoulder ached with the coming weather, the old bullet singing its familiar song of violence and regret. Change was coming to Whispering Valley, carrying with it echoes of a life he'd tried so hard to leave behind. Michael's questions about the yearling seemed straightforward enough, but there was something in the way the boy's eyes kept darting to the barn, to the house, to the carefully maintained sightlines that Daniel had spent years establishing. It was the look of someone mapping terrain, noting cover, planning approaches. "Mighty fine operation you've built here, Mr. Hawthorne," Michael observed, sipping his coffee. "Pa says he can't figure out how you manage it all, being—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Well, being a man of your years." Daniel allowed his hands to shake slightly as he gripped his walking stick. "The Lord provides, boy, and I've got good help. Speaking of which, I heard your pa's been hiring some new hands himself. Lots of strangers are riding for Double B these days." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A flash of something? Surprise? Concern? Crossed Michael's face before he could mask it. "Times are changing, sir. Pa says a man needs reliable help these days. Too many raiders coming up from Indian territory. Too many desperate men looking to make easy money." "Desperate men," Daniel mused, watching a hawk circle overhead. "Funny thing about desperate men. They tend to smell opportunity where there ain't none. Tend to see weakness where they shouldn't." Mary returned with more coffee, her movements carrying the same fluid grace that had once marked another young woman in Daniel's life. A woman whose death had taught him that sometimes the most dangerous predators wore badges and carried law books alongside their guns. "You two solving all the valley's problems?" she asked, her smile bright, but her eyes sharp as she studied the tension between the two men. "Just talking horses, dear," Daniel assured her, but he didn't miss how Michael's hand had drifted closer to his holster when Mary appeared, as if the girl's presence had somehow raised the stakes of their conversation. "Young Mr. Bennett here was just telling me about his pa's new hands." "Oh, yes," Mary's voice carried a hint of concern. "I saw some of them in town yesterday. Rough-looking bunch. Not like your usual cowboys, Michael." The boy's smile tightened slightly. "Can't always judge a man by his appearance, Miss Mary. Some of the roughest-looking fellows turn out to be the most trustworthy. And sometimes," his eyes flicked to Daniel, "the most harmless-looking folk turn out to be something else entirely." Marshal Reeves and his men took their time approaching Shadow Creek Farm, their horses' hooves kicking up dust that mixed with the threatening storm clouds above. Daniel watched from his porch, making sure his hands shook visibly as he gripped his walking stick. He'd sent Mary to the root cellar, accessible through a hidden trap door beneath the kitchen rug. The girl had argued, of course, but some tones of voice bypassed the argument and went straight to obedience. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Daniel called out, his voice wavering perfectly. "What brings the law all the way out to my humble spread?" Reeves dismounted with the fluid grace of a mountain lion, his false badge catching the last rays of sunlight before the storm swallowed them. Two of his men flanked him, a scarred giant they called Bear, and a wiry fellow whose eyes never stopped moving. The fourth rider, a younger man with a Confederate cavalry slouch, maintained his position by the gate. "Mr. Hawthorne," Reeves touched the brim of his hat, all courtesy wrapped around the threat. "Hoping you might help us with a peculiar situation. Seems some of our deputies went missing last week, right around these parts." Daniel let his rheumy eyes widen with manufactured concern. "Missing lawmen? Lord above, that's terrible news. Can't say I've seen anything unusual, though. Been laid up with my joints acting up something fierce." Bear snorted, clearly unimpressed by the old man's performance, but Reeves's smile only grew sharper, more knowing. He moved closer to the porch, boots creaking on each step. "Interesting thing about them deputies," Reeves continued, closing the distance. Last anyone saw, they were trailing a fugitive, fellow who'd stolen quite a sum from the territorial bank in Topeka. Trail led them right through your valley. Thunder rolled overhead as Daniel adjusted his grip on the walking stick. Within its hollow core, a shotgun barrel waited. Lots of folks pass through Whispering Valley. Can't say I pay much mind to them anymore. Age has a way of turning a man's thoughts inward. That so? Reeves was close enough now that Daniel could smell tobacco and gun oil on him. Because Turner over at the store seems to think you've been mighty interested in visitors lately. Buying extra supplies, asking about strangers in town. Getting old makes a man cautious, Daniel explained, letting a tremor enter his voice. These days I like to know who's about, times being what they are. Reeves's hand shot out faster than a man his size should move and grabbed Daniel's collar. The other men tensed, expecting resistance, but Daniel just wheezed and trembled like any frightened old-timer would. You know what I think? Reeves's breath was hot against Daniel's face. I think you know exactly what happened to my men. I think all this doddering old fool act is just that, an act. The way this farm is laid. Out, the way you've got sight lines to every approach. This ain't no regular farmer's design. Daniel allowed a single bead of sweat to roll down his temple, even as his mind catalogued the positions of Reeves's men. Bear had moved to cover the barn's main door, but he couldn't see the side entrance. The wiry one watched the house windows, while the youngest still held the gate, all exactly where Daniel would have placed them if their positions were reversed. I'm just a farmer, Daniel insisted, his voice cracking. Been one going on 8 years now. Before that, I worked in a store in Ohio. Never even fired a gun until I came west. Reeves's grip tightened. That's so? Then you won't mind if my men take a look around. Been hearing interesting stories about Shadow Creek, hidden rooms, secret passages. The kind of setup a man might need if he was expecting trouble. A raindrop hit the porch roof with a sound like a distant gunshot. Then another and another. The storm was finally breaking. Now see here. Daniel straightened slightly, letting some backbone show through his fear, just enough to be believable. You may wear a badge, but this is my property. You can't just... Reeves's backhand caught him across the face, sending him sprawling. The walking stick clattered across the porch boards, rolling to a stop against the wall. Daniel tasted blood and something else. The familiar copper-penny taste of violence approaching. Search everything, Reeves ordered his men. Tear it apart if you have to. Old man here's hiding something, and I mean to know what. Bear kicked in the front door, while the wiry one circled toward the back. Daniel lay where he'd fallen, seeming to struggle for breath, but his eyes caught movement in an upstairs window. Mary, who should have been safely hidden below, stood with his Henry rifle in her hands. The fool girl must have doubled back through the tunnel that connects the route. Cellar to the barn. Now she was positioning herself for a shot, just like Michael Bennett had been teaching her. But Daniel knew her hands weren't steady enough, her skills not quite there. If she fired and missed, rain began falling in earnest as Bear emerged from the house. Nothing on the first floor, boss, but we found this. He held up a wooden box containing spare ammunition, hidden in a false drawer. Real professional work. Reeves grabbed Daniel by his shirt front, hauling him up. Want to explain that, old timer? Don't recall many farmers knowing how to build hidden compartments. Man's entitled to protect his property, Daniel wheezed, playing for time. Through the rain, he could see movement near the barn. One of his hands, young Charlie Tucker, positioning himself with a rifle. The boy might complicate things. Bear, check the barn, Reeves commanded. Olson, get up those stairs. I want every inch of this place turned inside out. Daniel's mind raced. If they found the tunnel entrance, they'd know Mary was loose in the house. If they discovered the weapons caches, his cover would be blown. And if Mary took that shot... The decision was made for him when Bear kicked open the barn door and immediately ducked back as a bullet splintered the wood beside his head. Young Charlie Tucker had apparently decided to play hero. Got a shooter in the barn, Bear bellowed, drawing his gun. The sound of Charlie's Winchester working its lever echoed across the yard, followed by more shots. Bear and Olson both returned fire, forcing Charlie to retreat deeper into the barn. Reeves' grip on Daniel's shirt tightened. "Seems your hands are a mite more aggressive than most farm workers," he observed coldly. Almost like they were expecting trouble. Almost like they were hired for something besides farming. Daniel saw Mary steadying the rifle at the window and saw Charlie's desperate situation in the barn. The facade he'd built so carefully was crumbling, and people would die if he maintained it much longer. A decision crystallized in his mind, sharp and clear as the first time he'd ever drawn against another man. Sometimes the only way to protect a lie was to kill it yourself. "You're right about one thing," Daniel said, his voice suddenly steady and cold as mountain winter. "This ain't no regular farm." His arthritis-twisted hands moved with liquid speed, producing a derringer from his sleeve before Reeves could react. Daniel pressed the small gun's twin barrels against the false marshal's ribs. "But you're wrong about Ohio," he continued, all pretense of age and weakness vanishing. "Never been further east than St. Louis. Name's not really Daniel Hawthorne, either. 20 years back, folks used to call me Dead-Eye Dan McKenzie." Reeves's face went slack with recognition. Even out here, that name still carried weight. Dead-Eye Dan McKenzie, the man who'd hunted down the Whitfield gang one by one. The ghost that had tracked the border raiders into Mexico. The legend that had disappeared without a trace after the St. Louis incident. "That's a dead man's name," Reeves whispered. Daniel smiled grimly. "Lots of dead men's names in my past. About to be a few more unless you call your boys off real careful like." The rain fell harder now, drumming against the tin roof of the porch like distant gunfire. Reeves's men held their positions, muscles tense, waiting for their leader's word. Inside the house, Mary maintained her aim from the upstairs window while Charlie stayed hidden in the barn, his presence still providing covering fire. "Dead-Eye Dan McKenzie," Reeves repeated, testing the name like a man checking the edge of a knife. "Heard tell you died in that fire in St. Louis. 10, maybe 12 years back." "Rumors of my death were greatly exaggerated," Daniel now revealed, as Dan McKenzie kept the derringer pressed firmly against Reeves's ribs. "Now, how about you tell me what this is really about? Because we both know you're no more a marshal than I'm a simple farmer." Reeves's laugh carried no humor. "You really don't know, do you? All these years playing farmer, and you never figured out why this valley was so cheap when you bought it?" A new tension crept into Mackenzie's shoulders. He'd chosen Whispering Valley for its defensive position, its isolation. The price had seemed a blessing at the time. Now he wondered if it had been bait in a trap long in the springing. "Plenty of cheap land in Kansas territory," Mackenzie said carefully, watching Reeves's men for any sudden moves. Bear still covered the barn where Charlie was pinned down, while Olson kept his gun trained on the house. "Not like this piece." Reeves grinned, seemingly unconcerned about the derringer. "You built yourself a really nice farm here, Mackenzie. Real nice operation right on top of about 50,000 in gold dust and banknotes." The revelation hit Mackenzie like a physical blow. The Topeka bank job, 5 years back. Finally, the old gunfighter understood. "Biggest heist in territorial history," Reeves's voice dripped with mockery. "My crew had it all planned perfectly. Hit the bank, ride hard for Whispering Valley, stash the take in the caves up by Thunder Creek. Only something went wrong. Bank guard got lucky, shot our map man. Rest of us had to split up, circle back later." Mackenzie's mind raced through implications. "But when you come back, found a nice little farm being built right where we needed to dig." Reeves's eyes hardened. "Spent 5 years trying to figure out how to get our gold back. Watch you build. Your defenses, hire your hands, careful like. Almost convinced myself you knew about the money all along. The irony might have been funny if it weren't so deadly." All his precautions, his carefully maintained facade, had only convinced Reeves's gang he was guarding their lost fortune. A shout from the barn interrupted them. Bear had worked his way closer to the door where Charlie was hiding. "Boss, found something. Hidden door in the floor leads to some kind of tunnel." Mackenzie felt the situation slipping. If they found the tunnel network he'd built connecting the buildings, they'd eventually find Mary in the house, and the girl, for all her spirit, wasn't ready for this kind of fight. "Olson," Reeves called to his wiry watchman. "Check the house again, top to bottom. Old man here's been busy with more than just farming." But before Olson could move, a new voice cut through the rain. "That would be unwise, mister." Michael Bennett had finally decided to show his hand, stepping out from behind the tool shed with his gun trained on Olson. The young man's stance was perfect, his aim rock steady despite the weather. "Well now," Reeves's smile grew wider. "Seems the Bennett boys." "Chosen aside, your pa know you're mixed up in this, son?" "My pa knows exactly where I am," Michael replied, his voice carrying an edge Mackenzie hadn't heard before. "Just like he knew where I was last week when your deputies tried pushing into Thunder Creek. Man's got a right to protect his property." The pieces clicked together in Mackenzie's mind. James Bennett's questions about water rights, the careful way he'd been probing about Shadow Creek's defenses. The man hadn't been suspicious. He'd been looking for an ally. "Bennett and his bunch have been giving you trouble?" Mackenzie asked. Reeves, keeping his voice casual despite the derringer still pressed to the false marshal's ribs. Reeves spat into the mud. "Been claiming Thunder Creek as his water right, running off anyone tries to search up there. Almost like he's guarding something, or someone. Like the real Marshal Phillips who came asking questions last month," Michael added coldly. "Man. Disappeared awfully suddenly, didn't he, Reeves?" The accusation hung in the rain-heavy air. Mackenzie had heard about Phillips going missing, but he'd been too focused on maintaining his own cover to investigate. Another mistake. A sudden shot cracked from the barn, Charlie making another try for freedom, and the yard erupted into chaos. Bear returned fire, splintering wood. Olson, distracted by the noise, turned slightly from Michael's position. Reeves, tensed, ready to move. "Mary!" Mackenzie shouted, dropping all pretense. "Take the shot!" His granddaughter's rifle thundered from the upstairs window, the bullet catching Olson in the shoulder, spinning him into the mud. Michael immediately shifted his aim to Bear, forcing the big man to dive for cover behind a water trough. Reeves chose that moment to move, driving an elbow back toward Mackenzie's face, but the old gunfighter hadn't survived 30 years of violence by being predictable. He was already sliding sideways, Derringer barking twice. The first shot went wide, but the second tore through Reeves's gun belt, sending his revolver falling into the mud. "You've got grit, girl," Reeves shouted toward the window where Mary's rifle still waited. "But your grandpa's teaching you wrong. Never wound a man you mean to kill." As if to prove his point, Olson was already rolling, drawing his backup gun. Michael's shot kicked up dirt near the fallen man's head, but didn't connect. Bear used the distraction to make a dash for the barn's side door, likely aiming to flank Charlie's position. Mackenzie had retrieved his walking stick in the confusion, and now the hollow core slid apart, revealing the shotgun within. All pretense of age and weakness vanished as he worked the action with practiced speed. "Mary," he called out, "remember where we stashed the blasting powder?" "Yes, sir." Her voice carried a tremor, but her rifle stayed steady. "Good girl. When I give the word, put a shot right into that crate by the barn door. Michael, you get to cover. Charlie, get clear of that barn." Reeves, sprawled in the mud but still grinning, seemed to guess Mackenzie's plan. "You'll bring the whole place down." "Better than letting you find what's beneath it," Mackenzie answered grimly. All those hidden rooms and passages he'd built would serve one final purpose. But before he could give the order, hoofbeats thundered from the valley road. Through the curtain of rain, Mackenzie made out a line of riders approaching fast. Leading them was James Bennett himself, and beside him, "Is that who I think it is?" Michael called out, still covering Olson with his gun. Mackenzie nodded slowly, recognizing the tall figure riding at Bennett's side, the same man he'd once called friend before St. Louis, before the fire that was supposed to have claimed Deadeye. Dan Mackenzie's life. That's Marshall Stone, he confirmed. The real one. Man who helped me fake my death all those years ago. Reeves's laughter carried a note of desperation now. More of your secrets, Mackenzie? How deep does this hole of lies go? Mackenzie chambered a shell in the shotgun, eyes never leaving the approaching riders. Deep enough to bury us all if we're not careful. Question is, who's getting buried today? Thunder rolled across Whispering Valley like God's own warning shot. The storm was about to break in full, and with it every secret Mackenzie had spent 8 years trying to keep. The approaching riders spread out in a practiced formation that Mackenzie recognized. It was one he'd taught Stone himself back when they'd ridden together. James Bennett took the center while Stone and his deputies covered the flanks. They'd have the yard surrounded in moments. "Mary," Mackenzie called out, keeping his voice steady. "Remember that back trail we practiced? The one through Thunder Creek?" "Yes, Pa." Her voice shook slightly, but her rifle remained steady. "Time to use it. Take Charlie with you when he clears." The barn. "I'm not leaving you." The steel in her voice reminded him so much of her mother that it physically hurt. "Not asking, girl. Some debts need settling, and I aim to settle them clean." Mackenzie shifted his grip on the shotgun, watching Reeves's men tense at the movement. Young Charlie had managed to work his way closer to the house, using the chaos as cover. Michael Bennett maintained his position, but his eyes kept darting to Mary's window. James Bennett's booming voice cut through the rain. "Reeves! Mackenzie! Throw down your weapons and let's talk this through civilized." Mackenzie almost smiled at that. Civilized talks didn't usually start with a dozen armed men surrounding your home, but Bennett was playing a deeper game. He had to have brought Stone into this. Reeves, still in the mud but watching everything with snake-sharp eyes, called back, "Ain't nothing here needs talking about, Bennett. This is between me and the old man." This stopped being just about you the moment you killed Marshall Phillips. Stone's voice carried the weight of official justice, but Mackenzie caught the undertone of personal vendetta. "We found his body up in Thunder Creek, right where you stashed that Topeka gold, I reckon." The revelation hit the yard like another thunderclap. Bear and Olson exchanged nervous glances while Reeves's face darkened with fury. "You were supposed to be dead," he snarled at Mackenzie. "Both of you!" "Funny thing about fires," Stone replied, edging his horse closer. "They have a way of cleaning slates, giving men fresh starts. Ain't that right, Dan?" Memory flashed hot as burning timber. St. Louis 12 years ago. The bank vault empty, the money gone. Stone offers a way out, a chance to walk away clean. All it would cost was Deadeye Dan Mackenzie's name and reputation. "Some slates don't stay clean," Mackenzie answered, watching Bear try to work his way behind a rain barrel. "No matter how hard you scrub them." The sound of Charlie finally breaking from the barn drew everyone's attention. The young hand sprinted through the rain toward the house, but instead of following Mary's escape route, he dove through the front door. "Damn fool kid," Mackenzie muttered, but he knew why Charlie had done it. The ranch hands had their own orders, their own part to play in the defense Mackenzie had spent years preparing. Reeves seized the momentary distraction to roll toward his fallen gun, but Mackenzie's shotgun blast kicked up mud inches from his reaching. "Fingers, still quick for an old man," Reeves admitted, freezing in place. "Age is just another lie," Mackenzie replied. "Like badges, like names, like lawmen who hunt bank robbers just to steal their takes." Stone's horse shifted nervously at that last part. Mackenzie saw the moment his old friend realized he knew the truth about St. Louis. "Wasn't supposed to go that way," Stone said quietly. "If you just played along." "You mean if I'd let you pin the robbery on me?" Mackenzie kept his voice steady, despite the old anger rising. "Let you walk away with the money while I take the blame?" Bennett cut through the tension. "This can end peacefully. Reeves' crew goes to jail for Phillips' murder, the gold goes back to Topeka, everyone else walks away." Like hell. Reeves' laugh held no humor. You think your boy Michael's been courting Mackenzie's girl out of pure affection? Been watching this place for months, ain't you, Bennett? Looking for your own shot at that gold? The accusation struck Mackenzie like a physical blow. He looked at Michael, saw the guilt flash across the young man's face before being replaced by determination. Started that way, Michael admitted, guns still trained on Olson. But things change. People change. Mary's voice drifted down from the window, tight with betrayal. Michael Bennett, I'm going to shoot you myself when this is over. The rain intensified, drumming against the tin roof like 1,000 tiny hammers. Through the curtain of water, Mackenzie saw more movement in the tree line. Reeves's fourth man, the one who'd held back at the gate, was working his way around the yard's edge. But there was something off about his movement, something that tugged at Mackenzie's instincts. Then he noticed Stone's deputies shifting their positions, not to contain the situation, but to create a crossfire. Not aimed at Reeves's men, but at Bennett's group. The pieces clicked together with terrible clarity. Stone hadn't come to arrest Reeves. He'd come to eliminate witnesses. Anyone who knew about the Topeka job, about the bank gold, about Stone's own corrupt past. Clean all the slates at once, bury every secret in one bloody afternoon. Mackenzie had built Shadow Creek as a fortress, planning for every contingency, hidden passages, escape routes, cached weapons, and loyal hands selected for their ability to fight as much as farm. But he'd never planned for this many layers of betrayal, this many competing schemes all coming to a head at once. The storm clouds overhead had turned the afternoon dark as twilight. Soon, visibility would be down to arm's length, a good time for secrets to die, for old debts to be settled permanently. Mackenzie felt the weight of his choices pressing down harder than any rain. He could run. The tunnels would get him clear. Before anyone could follow, could let these vultures tear each other apart over gold he hadn't even known about. Mary was probably already halfway to the backup farm, assuming she'd actually followed his orders for once. But running meant living with one more lie, one more slate left dirty, and Deadeye Dan Mackenzie had spent 8 years drowning in lies, suffocating under the weight of Daniel Hawthorne's peaceful existence. The shotgun felt right in his hands, honest in a way that Walking Stick never had. Perhaps it was time to show them all why Deadeye Dan's name had once been whispered with fear from Missouri to Mexico. Mary, he called out one last time, your mother would be proud of the woman you've become. Remember that. Then Deadeye Dan, Mackenzie, the deadliest gunfighter most had thought long dead, stepped off his porch into the rain-soaked yard. Sometimes the only way to bury the past was to dig the grave yourself. Thunder Creek carved muddy rivers through Shadow Creek's yard as Mackenzie stepped away from the shelter of his porch. Behind him, 8 years of careful deception lay shattered. Ahead, a dozen men with guns waited to see what Deadeye Dan Mackenzie would do next. But it was Mary's presence at that upstairs window that weighed heaviest on his mind. "Girl," he called, out, not turning around. "Remember that story I told you about the wolf I found in my trap? The one I couldn't bring myself to shoot?" "Yes, Pa." Mary's voice carried a mix of confusion and fear, but her rifle remained steady. "Told you I let it go, because everything deserves a chance at freedom." Mackenzie's eyes tracked Stone's deputies as they shifted positions. "Never tell you the whole truth. Let it go because it reminded me of myself, trapped by choices, desperate to escape." Reeves's mocking laugh cut through the rain. "The legendary Deadeye gone soft over a trapped wolf? What other fairy tales have you been telling? Shut up." Michael's voice carried unexpected authority. "Man's talking to his daughter." Mackenzie allowed himself a small smile at that. Maybe the boy wasn't completely corrupted by his father's schemes after all. "Mary," he continued, "that wolf came back. 3 weeks later, led me to her den, showed me her pups. One of them was hurt, dying. She remembered I'd shown mercy, trusted me to help." He paused, letting the memory settle. "That pup grew into the finest hunting dog I ever had. Loyalty, once earned, runs deeper than blood." Understanding bloomed in Mary's voice. Like Charlie and the other hands, you gave them chances when nobody else would. Gave me more than a chance. Gave me back my life after that business in Dodge City, Charlie called from inside the house. Ain't about to forget that, boss. The rain drummed harder as Mackenzie's carefully assembled family revealed itself one by one. Ranch hands emerged. From hidden positions around the yard, Tom Hawkins on the stable roof, rifle ready, Miguel Ortiz behind the woodpile, twin revolvers gleaming. Even old Joseph Chen, who everyone thought was half blind, appeared at the bunkhouse door with a shotgun. Well, now, James Bennett's voice carried grudging respect. You've been building more than just a farm here, Mackenzie. Man's entitled to choose his family, Mackenzie replied, then turned to face Mary directly. Just like he's entitled to tell them the truth when it's time. The moment stretched, heavy with 8 years of unspoken history. Mary's rifle wavered. Slightly. That night I found you in the barn, Mackenzie said softly. You weren't running from raiders like you claimed, were you? Mary's breath caught audibly. Pa, don't. You were running from Stone's men. They'd killed your real father, Marshall Phillips, and you saw their faces. The revelation hit the yard like a lightning strike. Stone's deputies tensed while Reeves's cruel laugh rang out again. Oh, this is rich, Reeves crowed. The great Marshall Stone hunting down a little girl? What happened to your famous justice? Shut up, Stone's voice carried a deadly promise. Truth's always dangerous to men like you, Mackenzie replied. Mary saw you murder her father when he got too close to your connection with the Topeka robbery. She ran, smart girl that she was, and fate or luck or God himself led her to my barn. Mary's voice shook. You knew all this time? Knew the moment I saw you, girl. You had that same look I used to see in the mirror. Someone running from a past they didn't deserve. Mackenzie's voice gentled. Didn't matter then why you were running. It only mattered that you needed help. Same as Charlie, same as Joseph, same as all the strays I've taken in. Quite the confession, Stone observed coldly. Almost sounds like a dying man's last words. Mackenzie nodded slowly. Maybe they are, but they're honest words. Something you wouldn't understand, old friend. Michael Bennett suddenly spoke up. Pa, you knew about this? About Stone killing Marshall Phillips? James Bennett's face was a mask of carefully controlled rage. Son, there are things like using me to spy on Mary? Michael's gun shifted slightly, no longer covering Olson. Things like pretending to be honest ranchers while we helped Stone hunt down an innocent girl? The yard's tensions twisted, realigning like a kaleidoscope. Reeves' men seemed forgotten as Stone's deputies and Bennett's riders faced each other, with growing hostility. Mackenzie saw Mary's rifle steady again, saw the tears on her face replaced by cold determination. You killed my pa, she said, addressing Stone directly. Shot him in the back while he was reading my letter. I was supposed to be asleep, but I saw everything. Stone's hand drifted toward his gun. Dangerous memories, girl. Better off staying buried like your father. Only things getting buried today are lies, Mackenzie declared. Mary, remember that box under my bed? The one I told you never to open? Yes. Pa, time to open it. Inside you'll find papers, letters, evidence your father collected about Stone's dealings. Proof about St. Louis, about Topeka, about a dozen other robberies. Mackenzie's voice carried across the rain-soaked yard. Kept them safe all these years, old friend. Insurance against a day like this. The storm raged overhead as Stone's mask of righteousness finally shattered. 8 years, he spat, his wounded hand dripping blood into the mud. 8 years I've been hunting that gold, and all this time you were right here, building your little sanctuary for lost souls. Always did say you were blind to what was right in front of you, Mackenzie replied, shotgun unwavering. Through the E. Rain, he caught glimpses of his men repositioning, taking advantage of the prearranged signals worked into Charlie's lantern placement. Every light cast 2 shadows, one to blind, one to guide. James Bennett stepped forward, his horse nervous, beneath him. Let's not be hasty here. There's enough gold to what, James? Michael's voice cut through the rain. To buy back your honor, like you tried to buy mine by sending me to court, Mary. Son, everything I did was for the ranch, for our future. I've heard it before. Michael's gun remained steady, but his voice cracked slightly. Did you know about Phillips? About what they did to him? Bennett's silence was answer enough. Mary's rifle cracked once, sending stones remaining. Deputy diving for cover as she called down from the window. Your father knew everything, Michael, just like mine did. Difference is, my father chose justice over profit. And died for it, Stone snarled. No. Mackenzie's voice carried across the yard like thunder. He lived for it. Every piece of evidence he gathered, every note he made, they all live on. In that box upstairs, in Mary's memory, in the testimonies I've spent 8 years collecting from every crooked deputy and bought judge who grew a conscience. Reeves struggled to his knees, mud coating him like original sin. Pretty speeches don't change anything, Mackenzie. You're still outnumbered. Am I? Mackenzie allowed himself a grim smile. Joseph, show them what a half-blind cook can really do. The old Chinese man's first shot caught Stone's horse in the flank, sending the marshal tumbling as the animal reared. His second drove Stone's last loyal deputy back behind a water trough. All pretense of age and infirmity vanished as Joseph Chen demonstrated why he'd once been the most feared scout in 3 territories. You're not the only one who can wear a mask, Stone, Joseph called out, his accent suddenly pure Kansas. Some of us just wear them for better reasons. Through the chaos, Mackenzie kept his focus on Stone, watching his old friend's face as years of carefully constructed lies crumbled around him. Remember what you used to say? Back when we actually fought. For justice instead of just pretending. Don't you dare, Stone began, but Mackenzie continued relentlessly. A man's badge is just metal. It's what he carries in his heart that makes him a lawman. When did you forget that, Jack? When did gold become worth more than truth? Truth? Stone's laugh was hollow. Truth is whatever the man with the most guns says it is. You taught me that in Dodge City. No, Mary's voice carried down from above. My father taught me different. Show them, Pa. Show them what a real lawman carries. Mackenzie reached slowly into his coat with his free hand, drawing out a battered tin star. Not the fake badge Reeves and his men wore, but a real U.S. Marshal's shield, its silver surface dulled by years of hiding, but its authority undimmed. Had this since before St. Louis, he said quietly. Kept it even after I died. Reminder of what I used to be, what I still am, under all the lies. Special Deputy Marshal Daniel Mackenzie, appointed by Judge Hawthorne himself to investigate corruption in the territories. The revelation hit the yard like a physical blow. Even Reeves's remaining men lowered their weapons slightly, uncertainty replacing their earlier bravado. Stone's face had gone the color of chalk. That's impossible, he whispered. Hawthorne's been dead for 5 years, Mackenzie finished. Long enough for all his sealed documents to become public record, including the ones naming you as the prime suspect in a dozen bank robberies. Mary's father was working with me, Stone. Everything he found, everything that supposedly burned with him, it all went straight to Washington. Thunder cracked overhead like heaven's own judgment as Mackenzie took one step forward, then another. So here's the truth you've been chasing, old friend. There never was any Topeka gold hidden in Thunder Creek. That was just bait in a trap. One that you and Reeves walked right into, dragging all your corrupt deputies and bringing witnesses. With you. The rain seemed to pause, hanging suspended in the air as Stone processed Mackenzie's words. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of betrayal that might have been genuine if Mackenzie hadn't known better. 8 years of lies. Dan, building this place, gathering your evidence, turning my own men against me, all while pretending to be some broken-down farmer. Was any of it real? Our friendship? Your supposed redemption? The friendship was real enough, Mackenzie answered, each word measured carefully. The redemption, too. Just not the kind you thought. Wasn't redeeming myself from being a lawman. Was redeeming myself from letting you corrupt everything we once stood for. A shot cracked from the tree line, one of Reeves's men making a break for it. Joseph Chen's rifle answered, the sound sharp and decisive. A cry of pain suggested the old scout hadn't lost his touch. "Nobody leaves," Mackenzie called out. "Not until every truth sees daylight." James Bennett shifted in his saddle, rain dripping from his hat brim. "You're asking for a bloodbath, Mackenzie. These men won't go quietly. Like Phillips went quietly." Mary's voice carried such venom that Michael flinched. "Tell them, Mr. Bennett. Tell them how my father begged for his life. How he offered to forget everything he'd learned about your operations. How Stone shot him anyway, right in front of his own daughter." "Mary," Michael started, but she cut him off. "I was 13, Michael. 13 when I watched your father's friends murder mine. When I ran through the night, certain they were right behind me. When I finally collapsed in Mr. Mackenzie's barn, too exhausted and terrified to run anymore." Mackenzie remembered that night with perfect clarity. The storm had been worse than this one, nature's fury matching the violence that had driven a young girl to his door. He'd recognized the look in her eyes immediately, the same haunted gaze he'd seen in his own reflection after St. Louis. "The girl was half dead when I found her," he said, letting the memory color his voice. "Soaked through, shaking with fever. But you know what struck me most? She had her father's badge clutched in her hand. Wouldn't let go of it, even in her delirium. Kept mumbling about how they'd tried to make him take a bribe, tried to buy his silence, how he'd told them that justice wasn't for sale." "Justice," Stone spat the word like poison. "Justice is just a pretty word for power, Dan. Always has been. The mighty make the laws, the rest of us just try to profit from them how we can. That's what you told yourself in St. Louis?" Mackenzie's question cut deep. "When you set me up to take the fall for your first big score? When you arranged that fire to cover your tracks, not caring how many innocent people burned?" Stone's laugh was bitter as wormwood. "You still don't understand, do you? St. Louis wasn't my first, wasn't even my 10th. I'd been running that game for years before you came along, the righteous marshal, the incorruptible legend. You were just the perfect patsy, so convinced of your own moral superiority that you never saw the trap until it was too late." "Oh, I saw it," Mackenzie corrected him. "Saw it clear as day. That's why I let you think you'd won. Let you believe I'd died in that fire while your men made off with the bank's gold. Gave me the freedom to start hunting you proper, to unravel every thread of corruption you'd woven through 3 territories." Through the rain, he caught Mary's slight nod. She'd moved positions, exactly as they'd practiced. Every light, every shadow in the yard had been carefully planned for this moment. 8 years of preparation coming to fruition in one rain-soaked afternoon. "Your first mistake," Mackenzie continued, watching Stone's remaining men shuffle nervously, "was thinking you'd caught me in your trap. Truth is, I've been building this trap since the day you betrayed me. Every piece of evidence Mary's father gathered, every witness who came forward, every corrupt deputy who grew a conscience, they all led here, to this moment." Reeves, still kneeling in the mud, suddenly barked a laugh. "Pretty speech, Mackenzie. But you're forgetting something. Even if you take us in, prove every word, who's going to believe it? You're a dead man, remember? Dead men can't testify in court." "Don't need to." Mackenzie allowed himself a grim smile. "That's what a special deputy marshal's seal is for. Every piece of evidence I've gathered, every testimony I've taken, it's all been officially witnessed and sealed. Judge Hawthorne saw to that before he died. Man always did play a long game." The implications hit the yard like a physical blow. Stone's face went from chalk white to crimson as understanding dawned. "The judge," he whispered. "All those years he was building a case," Mackenzie finished. "One that would expose corruption at every level of territorial law enforcement. But he knew he needed someone on the inside, someone everyone thought was dead, someone with nothing left to lose." A horse whinnied nervously as lightning split the sky. In that brief illumination, Mackenzie saw the full tableau of his trap. Stone and his corrupt deputies caught between Joseph Chen's rifle and Charlie's steady aim from the house. Reeves and his men are pinned down by Mary's coverage from above. Bennett and his riders face their own moment of choice, led by Michael's unwavering stand for truth over family loyalty. "So here's how this plays out," Mackenzie declared, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd hidden for 8 years. "Everyone drops their guns. Every piece of corruption you've hidden, every crime you've covered up, every bribe you've taken, it all comes to light. The ones who cooperate might see mercy from the territorial court. The ones who don't." He let the threat hang in the rain-heavy air. Stone's hand drifted toward his spare gun, hidden in his boot. Mackenzie saw the motion, read the desperate calculation in his old friend's eyes. "Don't," he warned softly. 8 years of planning, Jack. 8 years of setting every piece in place. You really think I'd leave anything to chance?" As if in answer, more lanterns blazed to life around the yard's perimeter. Miguel Ortiz and Tom Hawkins emerged from their hidden positions, each leading 2 men in official U.S. Marshal uniforms. The trap wasn't just Mackenzie's elaborate deception. It was an officially sanctioned operation, years in the making. "Time to choose," Mackenzie announced to the yard at large. "Whose side of the law do you want to be on when this rain stops falling?" For a long moment, only the sound of rain filled the yard. Then Stone's bitter laugh cut through the drumming. "Drops. Always the righteous one, weren't you, Dan? So certain of your moral high ground. But you've forgotten something crucial about the law." Before anyone could react, Stone whistled, sharp and piercing. Suddenly, shots erupted from new positions in the darkness, beyond Mackenzie's carefully placed lights. 2 of the official marshals went down immediately, while others scrambled for cover. "You're not the only one who can plan ahead," Stone shouted over the chaos. 8 years is a long time to build a network, long enough to put my own men in every marshal's office from here to St. Louis. Mackenzie dove behind a water barrel as bullets splintered wood around him. Through the gunsmoke and rain, he saw his carefully constructed trap turning to chaos. Some of the official marshals had turned their guns on their companions, while others fought back in confused desperation. "Mary!" he shouted. "Pattern 3!" Without hesitation, his granddaughter's rifle began picking off the lanterns in a specific sequence, plunging parts of the yard into strategic darkness. They drilled this for years, preparing for the possibility that their own illumination might be turned against them. "Clever girl," Stone called out, admiration mixing with malice in his voice. "Shooting out the lights we need, leaving the ones that blind us. Phillips taught you well, before I put him in the ground." "Keep talking," Mary answered, her rifle crack punctuating each word. "Makes you easier to track." Michael Bennett's voice cut through the chaos. "Pa, your men are shooting at real marshals." "Had to be done, son," James Bennett replied, his own gun adding to the mayhem. "Too much at stake to let Mackenzie's self-righteousness ruin everything we've built." "Everything we've built?" Michael's disgust was palpable. "We used to be ranchers, Pa. Used to stand for something. When did we become this?" A bullet caught Michael's horse, sending the animal down with a scream. The young man rolled clear, finding cover behind an overturned wagon beside Mackenzie. "Your father made his choice long ago," Mackenzie told him, checking his shotgun's loads. "Question is, what choice are you making now?" Michael's response was to take careful aim at one of Stone's hidden shooters, his shot finding its mark with deadly precision. "Already made it, sir. Same night I realized what Mary really meant to me. More than gold, more than family loyalty. Some things are worth fighting for. Joseph Chen's voice carried from his position by the bunkhouse. Mr. Mackenzie, Stone's men are trying to flank through the barn. Charlie, Mackenzie called out, show them what we prepared for just such an occasion. Inside the barn, carefully concealed explosive charges, more of Charlie's handiwork, detonated in sequence. Not enough to destroy the structure, but perfectly placed to collapse certain support beams, sealing the hidden tunnel entrances and trapping Stone's flanking force inside. You're not the only one who can rig a building to burn, Mackenzie shouted to Stone. The words carried a double meaning, a reference to that long-ago fire in St. Louis that had started all this. Getting desperate, Dan? Stone called back. Willing to burn your own barn to stop me? What happened to all that talk about justice and proper procedure? Justice wears many faces, Mackenzie replied, using the conversation to track Stone's position. Sometimes it wears a badge, sometimes it wears a farmer's coat. And sometimes, he nodded to Mary, who had been silently repositioning, it wears the face of vengeance. Mary's shot caught Stone's hidden sniper in the shoulder, sending him tumbling from his perch in the upper barn window. The man's fall revealed something that made Mackenzie's blood run cold. He was wearing the uniform of the territorial governor's personal guard. How deep does this go, Jack? Mackenzie demanded. How high up have you bought your way? Stone's laugh carried genuine amusement now. You still think this is about bank robberies and corrupt deputies? Wake up, old friend. We're building something bigger than your small-minded morality can comprehend. A new order for the territories, where power flows to those strong enough to take it. Power without justice is just tyranny, Mary called out, her voice carrying her father's conviction. Tell that to the Indians, Stone shot back. Tell that to the settlers pushing west. Law's just a pretty word for whoever has the most guns. Your father never understood that, girl. That's why he had to die. Through the rain and gun smoke, Mackenzie caught glimpses of more movement in the darkness beyond his lights. Stone hadn't just brought backup. He'd brought an army. The corrupt marshal had obviously been preparing for this confrontation as carefully as Mackenzie had. Joseph, Mackenzie called out. How many? The old scout's response was grim. At least 30 more. Coming up from Thunder Creek, all wearing official badges of one kind or another. Reeves, who had been suspiciously quiet during the chaos, suddenly spoke up. Told you power was the only law that matters, Mackenzie. Stone's got men in every marshal's office, every governor's staff, every territorial court from here to Mexico. You think your evidence matters? Who's going to enforce it? I am. The new voice carried authority that silenced even the gunfire. From the darkness beyond Stone's positions rode a figure Mackenzie hadn't seen in 12 years. Judge Hawthorne. Himself, very much alive and flanked by a dozen hard-looking men wearing simple black armbands. Impossible, Stone whispered. You're dead. I saw your body. Funny thing about bodies, Hawthorne replied, his voice carrying the same dry humor Mackenzie remembered. They're remarkably easy to fake when you have help from someone who's already done it once. Mackenzie allowed himself a grim smile as the final piece of his plan fell into place. Sometimes the best trap was the one your enemy thought they'd already sprung. The judge's appearance transformed the battlefield in an instant. Stone's hidden reinforcements found themselves caught between Mackenzie's defensive positions and Hawthorne's advancing forces. The black armbands the judge's men wore weren't just for show. They marked them as members of the secretive marshal's special division, a unit whose very existence most thought was just frontier legend. Your men can stand down, Stone, Hawthorne called out, his voice carrying the weight of decades dispensing frontier justice. Or they can join you in a federal prison. Their choice, but they better make it quick. Stone's response was a desperate barrage of gunfire, but his shots went wide as Mary's rifle cracked again, forcing him back into cover. Through the rain, Mackenzie caught glimpses of corrupt deputies and false marshals lowering their weapons, realizing the tide had turned. Think carefully, Mackenzie added, advancing from his position. Stone's offer of power and gold won't mean much where you're headed. But a man who helps expose corruption, who stands for justice when it matters. Most, that man might find mercy in the judge's court, James Bennett's voice carried from somewhere in the darkness. Don't listen to their righteous talk. We're too deep in this to turn back now. Are we, Pa? Michael's question cut through the rain as he stepped into the light, his gun trained on his own father. Or are we just too scared to admit we lost? Our way? Son, everything I did was for our future. You've said that before. Michael's voice carried years of disappointment. But what future is worth selling your soul for? Worth helping murder good men like Marshal Phillips? The mention of Phillips's name brought a fresh wave of tension to the yard. Judge Hawthorne's men had encircled the remaining resistance, but Stone and his core followers showed no signs of surrendering. You want to talk about murdered men? Stone shouted. Let's talk about St. Louis, Dan. Tell them all how many died in that fire while you played dead and plotted your revenge. Wasn't revenge I was plotting, Mackenzie replied, moving steadily forward. Was justice. Same justice Phillips died protecting. Same justice Mary's been waiting for these past 3 years. Mary's voice drifted down from her position, steady as steel. Tell them about the letters, Mr. Stone. The ones my father found in your office. The ones that proved you've been taking bribes from the railroad companies, helping them force honest ranchers off their land. The revelation sparked murmurs among the remaining fighters. Even some of Stone's loyal men exchanged troubled glances. Railroads were just the beginning, Judge Hawthorne added. Stone and his network have been selling justice to the highest bidder across 3 territories. Bank robberies, land grabs, murder, all carefully orchestrated to look like random frontier violence. Had to be done. Stone's desperation was showing now. The territories are changing, new money coming in, new powers rising. Law had to change. With it. Law doesn't change, Mackenzie countered. Men do. They either stand for something or they fall for anything. Philip stood. Mary stands. Even Michael here found his way back to standing. He paused, letting his next words carry across the rain-soaked yard. Question is, who else is ready to stand? As if in answer, guns began clattering to the mud. First one, then another, then a dozen more as Stone's corrupted lawmen chose their future. James Bennett's voice rang out in rage. Cowards! After everything Stone promised you, his words cut off in a grunt of pain as Michael's shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him into the light. Promises built on lies don't stand, Pa. That's what Mr. Mackenzie's been teaching Mary, and through her, teaching me. Joseph Chen's calm voice carried from his position. More riders coming up the valley, Mr. Mackenzie, but these wear the mark of true law. Through his spyglass, Mackenzie made out the approaching force, territorial marshals led by men he recognized. Honest lawmen who'd been part of Judge Hawthorne's secret campaign against corruption. The net was finally closing. It's over, Jack, Mackenzie called to his old friend. 12 years of planning, 8 years of building this trap. Every piece of evidence, every witness, every corrupt deal you ever made. It's all coming to light. Nothing's over! Stone's voice carried the edge of madness now. Even if you take me in, my network runs too deep. There'll always be men willing to sell justice. Always be powers willing to buy it. Maybe so, Judge Hawthorne agreed, his quiet voice somehow carrying over the storm. That's why there'll always be men like Mackenzie. Men willing to sacrifice everything, name, reputation, even their own past, to protect what's right. Mary's rifle spoke once more, her shot precisely picking off Stone's last attempt to aim at Mackenzie. The girl truly was her father's daughter, in spirit if not in blood. You taught me something important in St. Louis, Jack, Mackenzie said, close enough now to see the desperation in his old friend's eyes. Taught me that sometimes a man has to die to serve justice. Dead-eyed Dan Mackenzie had to die so Daniel Hawthorne could build this trap. Had to let you think you'd won so we could expose every root of corruption you'd planted. The storm was beginning to ease, the rain softening to a gentle drumming that matched the approach of hoofbeats from the valley. Stone's remaining men were surrendering one by one, placing their false badges in the mud as Judge Hawthorne's forces took them into custody. "Tell me something, Dan," Stone called out, his voice suddenly tired. "All these years playing the broken down, farmer, taking in strays, building your little family of reformed sinners. Was any of it real? Or was it all just part of the trap?" Mackenzie looked up at Mary, saw Michael moving to stand beneath her window, watched Charlie helping Joseph Chen tend to the wounded, even those who'd been shooting at them moments before. Remembered all the moments of quiet justice that had filled the years between vengeance and vindication. "That's the thing about the truth, Jack," he replied softly. "Sometimes it's hidden in plain sight. Every lost soul I took in, every second chance I gave, they were all real. Because justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about protecting the innocent, about helping men find their way back to what's right." Stone's last stand came not with a bang, but with a desperate gambit that proved why he'd been such a dangerous adversary all these years. As the territorial marshals closed in from the valley, he suddenly straightened up, hands raised in apparent surrender. "Before anyone does anything final," he called out, his voice carrying that honey-sweet persuasion that had corrupted so many good men, "you might want to consider something, Dan. Remember that fire in St. Louis? The one where Deadeye—" "Dan Mackenzie supposedly died?" Mackenzie felt the shift in the air, saw how even Judge Hawthorne's men tensed slightly. "What about it, Jack?" 16 people died that night. 16 innocent souls caught in our little game of justice and corruption. Their families never knew the truth. Never knew their loved ones died because the great Deadeye Dan Mackenzie needed a convincing way to disappear. The accusation hung in the rain-heavy air. Mackenzie saw Mary's rifle waver slightly, saw the question in Michael's eyes. "That fire was your doing, Jack," Mackenzie replied. But Stone cut him off. "Was it? Who knew about the plan? Who could have warned those people? Who chose to let them burn so his death would be convincing?" Stone's voice carried triumph now. "See? That's the thing about playing dead, Dan. The bodies have to come from somewhere." Judge Hawthorne's quiet voice cut through the tension. "Are you confessing to murder, Marshal Stone?" "I'm saying none of us are clean in this," Stone answered. "Dan wants to talk about justice, about protecting the innocent. Ask him about Annie. Sullivan, about her 3 children, about how he let them walk into that building knowing what was coming." The name hit Mackenzie like a physical blow. "Annie Sullivan, the baker's wife who'd always saved a fresh loaf for him, whose children used to wave at him from their second-floor window. He hadn't known they'd be there that night. Hadn't known—" "Pa?" Mary's voice carried a tremor now. "What's he talking about?" "Your adopted father's a real piece of work, girl." Stone pressed his advantage, playing the righteous lawman while carrying just as much blood on his hands as any of us. "Judge, you want to talk about justice? Let's talk about—" The shot came. From an unexpected direction, James Bennett, still clutching his wounded shoulder, had managed to draw his hidden derringer. But instead of aiming at Mackenzie or the judge, he'd shot Stone. "My son's right," Bennett gasped as Stone fell. "Some souls are beyond saving, some lies too deep to bury." The yard erupted into motion again, but this time it was Judge Hawthorne's men taking control, securing the wounded, collecting weapons. Michael reached his father first, kicking away the derringer, while Mary covered them from above. Stone lay in the mud, blood spreading across his chest, his eyes fixed on Mackenzie. "Tell them, Dan," he wheezed. "Tell them about St. Louis, about how deep the lies really go." Mackenzie moved to kneel beside his old friend, his voice pitched for Stone's ears alone. "I did warn them, Jack. Every single one. Annie Sullivan and her children weren't there that night. They were safe at her sister's farm, along with everyone else who lived in that building. The bodies you found? Criminals who died in prison, placed there by the same corrupt system? You built. Understanding bloomed in Stone's fading eyes. All this time, the fire was real, the deaths were real. But the innocent souls you think I sacrificed, they were part of the plan. Every single person in that building was either already dead or working with us. Judge Hawthorne made sure of that. Then why? Stone's voice was barely a whisper now. Why let me believe? Because I needed you to think you had something on me. Needed you to believe you understood the kind of man I really was. Made you careless, Jack. Made you trust that I was as corrupt as you, just better at hiding it. Stone managed a weak laugh that turned into a cough. Always were the better lawman, Dan. Better liar, too. As Stone's eyes closed for the last time, Mackenzie stood slowly, facing the yard full of witnesses to this final confession. Mary had climbed down from her position, standing beside Michael as Judge Hawthorne's men began the process of sorting the living from the dead, the redeemable from the damned. Mr. Mackenzie, one of the territorial marshals, approached. "We've found something in Stone's saddlebags. Letters, names of every judge, marshal, and politician he ever bought. Goes all the way to Washington." "Good," Mackenzie nodded. "That's the last piece we needed. Judge?" Hawthorne stepped forward, his presence commanding attention even from the prisoners being led away. "For 3 years, we've been building a case against corruption in the territories. Stone's network reached into every level of law enforcement, every corridor of power, but a snake's most vulnerable when it thinks it's got its prey cornered." "That's what all this was about?" Michael asked, supporting his wounded father. "Shadow Creek, the gold story, everything. It was all just bait?" Mackenzie looked at the young man who'd chosen truth over family loyalty, at Mary who'd carried her father's badge and burden with equal courage, at the ranch hands who'd found redemption in serving a justice higher than mere law. Shadow Creek was never just a trap, son. It was a testament. Proof that even in a corrupt world, good men can find their way back to what's right. Every man here who chose to stand with us today, they're living proof that justice is more than just words written in law books. The storm had passed completely. Now, morning sun breaking through clouds to illuminate the transformed battlefield. Shadow Creek would never be the same. Too many secrets had been exposed. Too many lies laid bare. But as Mackenzie watched Judge Hawthorne's men begin documenting evidence that would shake the territories to their foundations, he realized maybe that was the point. "What happens now?" Mary asked, her hand finding Michael's as she looked to her adopted father for guidance. Mackenzie touched the marshal's badge that had hung hidden beneath his coat for 8 years. "Now? Now, we finish what your father started. Stone's network is exposed, but there's more work to be done, more corrupt men to bring to justice, more lost souls to help find their way back." James Bennett spoke up from where he sat, awaiting medical attention. "Those of us who were part of Stone's schemes, what becomes of us?" "That depends," Judge Hawthorne answered, "on how much truth you're willing to tell, on how far you're willing to go to make things right." 3 months after the battle that became known as the Shadow Creek Reckoning, Mackenzie stood on his newly rebuilt porch, watching the autumn sun paint the valley in familiar golds and ambers. The bullet holes had been patched, the blood washed away by summer rains, but Shadow Creek would never be quite the same. Judge Hawthorne's investigation had shaken the territories to their core. Stone's letters had exposed corruption reaching into every level of government, leading to resignations, arrests, and a complete overhaul of territorial law enforcement. But more importantly, they'd led to redemption for those willing to embrace it. The old scout had accepted a position training new marshals in tracking and frontier justice, turning his hard-won skills to serving the law he'd once fled. His first class included 3 men who'd fought against them that rainy day, men who'd chosen to rebuild their lives on a foundation of truth rather than power. Michael helped Mary with the horses while Mackenzie opened Joseph's letter first. "Says his training program's going well. 4 more of Stone's former deputies have asked to join, wanting to learn how to be real lawmen instead of just wearing the badge." Like father, like daughter, Michael observed with a smile, teaching others to find their way back to what's right. Mary's answering look carried equal parts love and lingering sadness. Both my fathers taught me that. One with his life, one with how he lived after everyone thought him dead. The Washington letter proved to be from the territorial governor himself, officially recognizing Shadow Creek as a training ground for a new kind of lawman. Men who understood that justice wasn't just about enforcing laws, but about helping others find redemption. They're calling it the Phillips Mackenzie program, Mary read over his shoulder, for law officers who demonstrate exceptional moral courage in addition to traditional skills. Your father would be proud, Mackenzie said softly. Not just of the program, but of the woman you've become, the choices you've made. Charlie emerged from the barn, where he'd been working with their newest batch of recruits, former outlaws and corrupt deputies learning to serve justice instead of power. Latest groups showing promise, boss. Even that former banker from Topeka, the one who used to launder money for Stone. He's got a real knack for tracking financial crimes now. Mackenzie nodded, remembering his own journey from vengeance to justice. Sometimes those who've walked the crooked path make the best guides. Back to what's straight. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Judge Hawthorne rode at the head of a small group, his presence still commanding respect, even though he'd officially retired from the bench. Behind him came several men wearing the black armbands of the Marshal's Special Division, the same unit that had helped spring the trap on Stone's corruption. "Dan!" the judge called out in greeting, dismounting with the ease of a much younger man. "Got some news you'll want to hear." Inside the house, over coffee, Mary had learned to make just as well as her adopted father. Hawthorne laid out the latest developments. Stone's network hadn't died with him. Like a wounded snake, it had tried to strike back through its remaining supporters. 3 attempts to free James Bennett from custody, the judge reported. All failed, thanks to Michael's information about his father's old contacts. But it proves there's still work to be done. There's always work to be done, Mackenzie agreed, watching through the window as Charlie led the recruits through their morning drills. Evil doesn't die just because you expose it. It just finds new shadows to hide in. Which is why we need men like you, Hawthorne replied. Men who understand that redemption is as important as justice. The territories are changing, Dan. Railroad money, land speculators, corrupt politicians. The temptations are getting bigger, not smaller. Mary set down fresh coffee, her movements carrying the same quiet confidence that had kept her steady through that final confrontation. That's why Shadow Creek exists now, not just as a trap for corrupt men, but as a beacon for those wanting to find their way back. A beacon and a warning, Michael added. Every man who trains here learns both sides of the story, how easy it is to fall, how hard but worthwhile it is to rise again. Through the autumn-bright window, Mackenzie watched his legacy taking shape. Not in the bullets he'd fired or the lies he'd told, but in the lives he'd helped rebuild. Every reformed deputy, every redeemed outlaw, every lost soul who found their way to Shadow Creek carried a piece of that legacy forward. You know, Hawthorne mused, when we planned this 12 years ago after St. Louis, I never imagined it would become something this meaningful. Thought we were just setting a trap for corrupt men. Best traps are the ones that catch more than their intended prey, Mackenzie replied. Stone thought Shadow Creek was about hidden gold. Never understood it was about something far more valuable. Hope, Mary said simply, her hand finding Michael's. Hope that no matter how far someone's fallen, they can find their way back if someone's willing to light the way. As if to emphasize her words, a new group of riders appeared on the valley road. More recruits, more souls seeking redemption, more chances to prove that justice was about more than just punishment. Ready for another round? Hawthorne asked, seeing Mackenzie eye the approaching riders. The man who had been Dead-Eye Dan, who had played the role of Daniel Hawthorne, who had found his truest self somewhere between vengeance and mercy, smiled at his adopted daughter and the family she represented, not just of blood, but of choice. Truth is, he said quietly, I've been ready for this my whole life. Just didn't know it until I stopped trying to bury the past and started using it to build a future. The autumn sun caught the marshal's badge he now wore openly, its silver surface no longer dulled by hiding. Sometimes the best way to honor the dead wasn't through vengeance, but through redemption. Sometimes the truest justice came not from the law books, but from the second chances that gave the law its meaning. Shadow Creek would continue its work, standing as a testament to that truth. Not just as a home or a training ground, but as living proof that even in a world of corruption and compromise, good men could find their way back to what was right, if only someone was willing to light the way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.